Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today we have a nice occasion and a special guest. Today we'll have a book presentation. This is one of the book presentations in the series that the East Central European Center is organizing. My name is Aleksandar Bošković, and I am a co-director of East Central European Center. And today it's my pleasure to have a conversation with author of the book, Orbánland, Lasse Skytt, who is a Danish foreign correspondent who has been covering Hungary and Central Europe for almost a decade. And he was previously based in Copenhagen, London, New York City, and got his degree in journalism from the New School and also University of Southern Denmark, and has been living in Hungary since 2013, so it's almost a decade. Yeah, today you're here with us to tell us a little bit more about the book you have been writing for how long?
So thank you for having me, and I think I started writing the book in my head when I arrived, but of course, as I'm writing in the book, two certain events motivated me to put everything together, and that was first the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump in this country, because I saw a lot of the similarities to what was already happening in Hungary at that time, with Viktor Orbán, the prime minister, basically controlling and governing the country very firmly, but also inspiring a lot of people in Hungary and later on also abroad to engage in politics in a new way. And there's quite a lot of similarities to Trump in the United States, but also to other countries who've been, where we've seen leaders who have inspiring new people to come into politics, but also contributing to a polarization that was probably already kind of building up. But so at the moment, Hungary is the most polarized country in the European Union, which means that there's the distance from the right wing of Viktor Orbán's party, Fidesz, to the left wing is very, very, very long. And basically, what I'm trying to understand in the book is also to kind of, how can we close that gap? How can we, start listening again to each other, talk over this canyon that is opened up in not only Hungary but many Western societies. And I came from Copenhagen, like you mentioned. I write in the book that I came from a liberal echo chamber in my little bubble in Copenhagen, hanging around with all the other journalists and voting for the same parties, going to the same bars and coffee places, reading the same newspapers. And then I came to Hungary, and by chance, I ended up not in Budapest, which is the capital, but I ended up in Debrecen, thanks to my wife, Nadia, who is an Icelandic citizen who wanted to become a doctor in Hungary. So that was actually why we ended up there. And by not being in Budapest all the time, I understood some other things that I think was necessary for me to kind of grasp this new land that I had arrived to, because obviously I spent a lot of time in Budapest because that's where everyone is who is in power, in media, and so on. So I spent a lot of time there, and what I experienced was a lot of the same things that I had heard in Copenhagen. So, a liberal echo chamber, as I call it, where people were, of course, and there's many valid reasons to be very critical of the Orbán government. But also, I found there was a lack of understanding, or like a wish to really understand what Hungary was and why so many people kept voting for Viktor Orbán, not only one time or two times, but 3 times. And then in, what is it, 10 days, we have a new election in Hungary, and people might be voting for him again in the same manner. So that's kind of my arrival, and then what I bring into the book is all of my experiences going through trying to understand this country, why it's so divided, why people vote for Viktor Orbán, why not only Hungarians care about it now, but also the rest of Europe and basically the rest of the world. There's a lot of eyes on Viktor Orbán, and I'm sure we'll touch upon the war in Ukraine as well, because that kind of put everything to a new perspective. But yeah, so that's pretty much my introduction, I would say.
Well, thank you. That is interesting to have a little insight in the background, how you ended up in Hungary out of all these European countries. And it's definitely a European democracy with its own specificities, to put it mildly. But I'm curious to find out more about the structure of your book, the materials that you were looking to include, the cultural production that you are interested, or you were interested or inspired to look at and write about. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically the book, I decided to divide it into 3 parts. So roughly the first part is my observations of arriving to this country, but also arriving at a time where the introduction chapter is focusing a lot on the refugee and migrant crisis of 2015, which basically brought Viktor Orbán out as a European leader for many people in opinions. And so that's the first part. The second part is a collection of many of the articles that I've done over the years. So touching upon migration, but also on other topics like gender ideology, which is very criticized by the government. So I speak to a lot of people. There's a chapter on the movie industry of Hungary. There's a chapter on crime fiction where I talk to this this unknown Hungarian writer who writes crime fiction and gave me a very good understanding of this country. I never met him. I don't know if that's his real name, Bošković. He wrote a book called Budapest Noir, and that kind of got me into understanding the city of Budapest. Also, there's a chapter about Tucker Carlson, who is the Fox News host, who came to Hungary last year to meet with Viktor Orbán, but also to give a speech at a big event that was organized by people close to the Prime Minister. So there's all these kind of different angles on trying to grasp this country. And then the last chapter is digs even deeper and into the Hungarian mind, you could say. So I interview 16 different people, basically 8 who are supporters of Orbán and 8 who are very critical. So, and those interviews are, I call them conversations, because the easy thing as a journalist would be to just, interrupt when someone was talking and say, hey, wait, that's not correct, or is it? Or but instead I let people talk, ask new questions, of course, to follow up. But I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a different approach to those conversations. So my hope is that people who read the book will read it with an open mind, that's how I made the book. So basically, I think I write there's like an author's note where I kind of write what I just said about the three parts of the book. And I'm saying that, of course, you should read the book from page 1 to 300, but you can also browse around. And I recommend to start with the chapters that feels most provoking, maybe, and read about the people you don't disagree with. Read about those people first, instead of being, oh, I don't care what they think. So that was my whole approach. And so I learned a lot from doing these interviews. And then in the end, there's a conclusion that I hope we all can use going forward.
Mm-hmm. It looks to me that last part conversation is actually really, to me, the most interesting, mm-hmm. and especially because those are interviews, those are people who are living in Hungary and have their own opinions formed for better good reasons. And it's interesting that you put them in dialogue in a way, and I hope to get to that point maybe mm-hmm. later in conversation. But could you tell us, let's start maybe from the right order.
Yeah.
And maybe could you tell us a little bit more about migration as a political issue that brought voters closer to Orbán, and how did that unfold?
So when I arrived in 2013 in Debrecen, I went to the immigration office because as a foreigner, you had to register there. And right next to the immigration office was a refugee camp. So I noticed that, and this was 2013, so there was around 2 years before it all culminated. And I noticed that there was a lot of people. So I looked into it, and already at that time, this refugee camp was growing and growing and growing. More people were coming into Hungary and into Europe, but a lot of people were staying in Hungary. And I think around 6 months later, there was some big riots going on in this refugee camp. And it grew more and more. And I started seeing a lot of refugees, migrants from especially from the Middle East. This is when the war in Syria was really building up. And what I noticed was that the Hungarians at the time didn't, like most of them, didn't even really look at these people. They just kind of ignored them or looked the other way, even though they were quite significant in the public streets. And I was thinking, like, why are people not engaged in maybe helping these people? Of course, there was some who did that, but my general experience of it was people didn't really care. And then I talked to some people, and they told me we don't owe these people anything. And that was a new view on coming from a very multicultural country, I would say, like Denmark. Also been living in London and in New York. So people just and this was in Debrecen, this is not Budapest, was a little bit different view. And then I think it was at the Paris terror attacks in not at the Charlie Hebdo, exactly. So early January 2015. Orbán was the first leader who gave a speech where he basically said there's a connection between migration and this terror threat, which was very big at the time. Also at the time, his party, Fidesz, were kind of decreasing in support in the Hungarian population. Meanwhile, Jobbik, which is a far-right party at the time, were growing up, and they came up with ideas like we should not let in migrants. We should build a fence. We want a Hungary for Hungarians. And Orbán, I think, saw this as an opportunity to kind of take over this rhetoric, because it was a threat from the right. And he did so by connecting these topics, and also as the refugee stream and the refugee topic grew into the European attention, then he ended up building this fence to the Serbian border in 2015 in September. And that was a very dividing decision, because a lot of people in the EU and the Western countries were criticizing Orbán for basically going the other way than most people. You know, the Chancellor Merkel was saying, "Wir schaffen das," we should be able to help these people, but Orbán was taking a complete other approach. And a lot of people in Hungary, but also abroad, loved this development, because they've experienced this pressure from migrants, from refugees, and especially from Muslim people who are, in their view, very difficult to integrate into the European culture. So this was some controversial views that started becoming more mainstream, you could say. And Viktor Orbán had a very big role to play in spreading out this opinion.
If I can interrupt you, how did that reflect to the voting body in that time? Did you talk to people? I guess different people had different opinions.
I did. There's a few of the interviews here where we talk about this topic. When I give talks to students who come to Budapest, I always show this very, very boring opinion poll graph, which shows that Jobbik at the time was growing and Fidesz were, losing support. And then right at the time where the fence was built, the summer of 2015, early fall, the graph goes like this. So Jobbik loses support and Fidesz grows. So it really connected to the voters, and Orbán's party was able to win over, I think, a lot of previous Jobbik voters. And politically, I would say that's a very, very smart thing to do, because he won the election again in 2018. Migration was a big topic in that election campaign. And basically, people ask me why do Hungarians keep voting for Viktor Orbán? I think a cult is maybe the wrong word, but there's a very, very firm mobilized base of Fidesz voters who agrees with what Viktor Orbán says. But I think it also goes the other way. Viktor Orbán really understands a lot of the Hungarian people. So I found that very interesting, and I know in the States here there are very many similarities to how Donald Trump motivated people to engage in politics, to kind of get involved and follow the leader. And on the cover is a photo of Orbán with Donald Trump standing here in the background. And I think it's
like building the fence would be another common denominator, or the wall.
Exactly.
Okay, that is something to think about, these parallels. They have also Putin on the cover, so I hope we'll get there. So maybe I can ask you now, what is now the attitude that Orban's government has towards refugees that are flooding Europe from the east.
So that's very interesting because I think today it's 1 month since war started, and 500,000 Ukrainian refugees have arrived in Hungary. And interestingly enough, Hungarians have been very, very welcoming, conversely to what happened in 2015. And I think, and Orban said that it's not, he said it's not rocket science why people are more welcoming to the neighbor country. People basically, it's women, it's kids, it's a war that's nearby, and people with a similar culture that to Hungary. Whereas back in 2015, it was Muslims, it was young men from far away, who've traveled through several countries. So the Hungarian understanding of welcoming Ukrainians is a little bit different than what it was back then. There's a great little documentary on The Guardian that I saw yesterday from a small border town of, I think, 600 people. Every day, 1,200 people, refugees are coming into the town. And there's a woman being asked, so what do you think about all this? And she says, we haven't had time to think about it yet, because now we just have to do what we have to do, and then we will reflect on it later. So we tend to forget that this war is only 4 or 5 weeks old.
Right.
And I think as it goes on, if it continues, then we might see some different opinions develop in this topic as well.
Yeah. But the perception of the refugees is diametrally opposite from what was the case in the 1930s. Okay. Okay, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about cultural production in the last decade that you're looking at, such as film and then crime novel, as you mentioned. What were the insights that you gained from looking at those specific cultural products, and how do they relate to Orban's rule and the way that his populism is bringing him, still keeping him in power yet still?
So I approached Andy Weiner, who is not alive anymore, but he's in the book interviewed, and he's a Hungarian of origin, but he produced movies in Hollywood for many years. And then when Orban came to power in 2010, he invited Andy Weiner to come back to Hungary and kind of restart the Hungarian film industry. Hungarian film has always been very recognized, but also for kind of a narrow audience. So Orban wanted Andy Weiner to make Hungarian film great again and bigger, to a broader audience, make it more mainstream. And so before I interviewed him, basically hundreds of film awards were given to different Hungarian films. And I found that very interesting, like how you can in so few years kind of bring a country and its movie industry up to a level that speaks not only to Hungarian viewers, but to the whole world. So if some of you have seen The Son of Saul, that movie won the Oscars in 2017, I think. And that was like the climax of this whole build-up. And the interesting thing is, many of these films are, well, they're not critical towards the Hungarian government, but they touch upon topics like migration, the Roma minority. There are many movies who are kind of critical. So you would say, like, if this is a dictatorship, which I don't think Hungary is, but then you wouldn't make these movies because they're very critical about the topic. We just talked about refugees, for example. So I just wanted to understand, like, how is the process of developing these movies? And I was lucky to get an interview with Andy Weiner, who also happened to be not only a leader of the Hungarian Film Fund, but also the owner of a big media outlet, TV2, and one of the biggest owners of casino license in Hungary. In other countries, you use the word oligarch for people like that. And so when I interviewed him, I was focusing about the film, like how did you do the film, but I kind of slipped in a few questions about his political relationship with the prime minister, and he was ready to talk, and it was interesting to hear how he viewed it, because his opinion, the media landscape of Hungary is more free than in any Western country. Maybe we'll get to that later. But he was like a core Fidesz mindset who has a very, very big role in media, and in casinos.
In casinos, yeah. Very interesting. So I assume that his films are state-funded films.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah.
And is yet critical about certain issues, like sore issues for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And you were interested in why is that the case, and how that's possible.
Yeah.
That reminds me a little bit of the situation in the communist Yugoslavia, when the state would fund the films which are highly critical of its own arrangement of or social contract and administration. And then they would send these films abroad to win awards.
Yeah.
So that's similar model. And what about the crime novel?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned the crime novel Budapest Noir before, written by Vilmos Kondor, and that was just I was just interested in, because I read that book, and it talks a lot about history. And in my country, in Denmark, and in the Nordic countries, Nordic noir has been a big wave in crime novel and in films. And those productions are mostly focusing on the current times.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the crime novels in Hungary were focusing on the past.
Mm-hmm.
And this also goes in Poland and Romania. I talked to some people there.
When you say past, can you be more precise?
Yeah, so basically, my conclusion was that big historical events like Second World War, the 1956 revolution in Hungary, the communist times, were topics that people have not been able to kind of reflect so much on. It's only been 3 decades since collapse of communism, and everything happened so quickly after that, and maybe people have not been able to look back and understand what these historical events meant for example, the Hungarian culture and life and mindset. But the crime novels, they dig into these historical events, fictionalized, but still set in those times. And I think a reason why they are so popular in Hungary and also in Poland and Romania is that suddenly people can sit and read stuff that maybe they never really addressed. And I can only recommend to try to read some of those books, because you learn a lot from them. Not only it's great writing, but it's also kind of a Hungarian view on those events. So that's in the book as well.
Yeah, I'll just use now opportunity. If anyone has a question, feel free to interrupt and introduce yourself and ask questions. Because from Zoom, on Zoom, we already have someone asking. It's Ermin Mujezinovic, a graduate student here at Harriman Institute, asks, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have you seen a change in Orbán's or Hungary's perspective or stance?
Very good question. And it's a complicated one, because so I can go back to 1st of February. Viktor Orbán visited Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and he was the first one, I think, to sit at this long white table that we all know now. And so this was 3 weeks before the war started, and it was already building up at the time. So Orbán communicated that he was on a peace mission to try to maybe talk Putin out of what he was about to plan. Of course, that didn't really work out. And Orbán has had a very, very close relationship with Vladimir Putin over the years. He's, I think, the leader in Europe who's met the most times with Vladimir Putin. And there's a very big cooperation between Hungary and Russia in terms of energy supplies. There's a big, very, very controversial investment bank, in a Russian investment bank, which moved its headquarters to Budapest. And of course, the whole view on media, the people with money, oligarchs, the understanding of LGBT rights and so on and so on. We've seen many of the politics that Putin has legislated being kind of copied in a Hungarian version. So when the war started, I think it brought Orbán into a big dilemma, because Hungary is a member of the European Union and NATO. So the first communication was very clear from Orbán, actually. It was the first week. He said, we support all the sanctions. We will do whatever it takes. And then I think also he called President Zelensky and kind of gave his condemnation of the Russian invasion. But then after 1 week of the war, the communication changed a little bit from the government of Hungary. So first of all, well, I can say that that's only a couple of days back. The foreign minister of Hungary said there's a red line in this terms of the sanctions, and the red line is we don't want to block the Russian energy supplies into Hungary. We cannot support those sanctions, and that has, of course, to do with that a lot of gas and oil from Russia is coming into Hungary. It's a very big part of the energy supply. So that's been a view that he's been very open about. I think other countries in Europe who are also very dependent on the Russian gas have been more quiet. And I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll see a lot of discussion on this topic, depending on how the war develops. But of course, so my book is, like I mentioned before, very much focused on the polarization of the West. And we've heard in the last couple of weeks that now, finally or suddenly, the West is again united and against a common enemy, which is Russia. And Orbán stands kind of awkwardly in the middle and tries to balance his views. And so in the elections, we'll see what the Hungarian voters will decide, east or west, like the opposition is communicating. But I have to mention again that the war is only 4 weeks old. This polarization of our societies, I don't think it just disappeared overnight. Of course, it changed a lot of things with this war. It's a huge historical event, but I think it'll be interesting to see in the next weeks, months, how this polarization will play out, and if it continues, or if our world order is suddenly a new one, or if the liberal world order will still be under huge pressure as it has been.
Yeah, we did talk before the event and mentioned how Orbán got really close to Serbian president, who is outside. I mean, Serbia is outside of Europe, but also tries to play this role of balancing between the Western sanctions and their own interest or protection that they are receiving from Russia and China. And we did mention also that Orbán went to open this really short train,
like a railroad,
right, that goes all the way from Piraeus, from Greece to Budapest.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit about that and how that connects to relation to Russia as well?
Yeah, so we've all heard about the new Chinese Silk Road. China is doing a lot of infrastructure into Europe, all the way from China. And from the beginning of his government, Orbán in 2010 has been, he calls it his Eastern opening.
Mm-hmm.
So he's been trying to get very close to China and also to Russia. And this railroad is the last, I think, of the Silk Road coming into the EU. There's a chapter in the book about this Chinese influence. And what's important to understand is that because of these, like the reasons for these views that you also see in Serbia, but also you see it in other Eastern European countries, has been a disappointment with the West. So in Hungary's example, after the collapse of communism, there's a huge hope of now finally becoming a part of the West and kind of lifting society up economically and socially. But then in the 1990s, huge disappointment followed instead, because there was a very fast liberalization of the Hungarian economy, and that did not benefit the broad population of Hungary. So there was then a new hope building up towards now we become a member of the European Union in 2004. Big hopes for that, and then again big disappointment because financial crisis hit a few years later and had huge consequences for Hungary. And also there's a political scandal with the current with the previous government of the left. The prime minister at the time did a speech to his party members and kind of acknowledged that this was all lies that they had built the economy on, and he didn't want to leave office, and huge protests followed and so on and so on. So Orbán came in at a time where basically a big part of the Hungarian population were very disappointed with what they had experienced of the West of the European Union. So this Eastern opening was a part of that. You wanted to kind of course, be a European Union member, but also be able to connect with China, with Russia, with other Eastern states who are growing in power and economy. So Hungary, Orbán saw very big opportunities, and I discuss in the book how well it has played out for him. But it's definitely important to understand why that happened, because of what happened before. That was the reasons for that. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have a question from the audience and from YouTube as well.
So,
Okay.
thank you for joining us. My name's Cyrus. I'm a first-year student studying at School of International Public Affairs here, and also at the Harriman Institute. My question is, who is the prototypical Orbán voter in Hungary? You draw parallels with Trump, and I think after 2016, there was this narrative in the U.S. that the people who elected Trump, were essentially estranged working-class white men. That turned out actually not to be the case. If you look at the data, the average income of your typical Trump voter is higher than it is for Democrats, for example. So I'm curious if there's a similar narrative about who the typical Orbán voter is, and if you could complicate that a little bit. And then as a quick follow-up, I'd love your prognosis for the upcoming election, what you expect to happen.
Yeah. Well, so you're right. The first understanding of the typical Orbán voter from a Western perspective would be that it's a poor, elderly person from a small village. And they do tend to vote for Viktor Orbán. But as in America, there's also a very big part of Fidesz voters who are in the, you say, upper class, upper middle class, and even the middle class. So I think the most important understanding of it is that, so in Hungary, you have Budapest as the capital with 2 million people. The country is a little less than 10 million in total. So you have almost 8 million people living outside of Budapest. And the second biggest city is where I had my base in Debrecen. It's only 200,000 people. There's a huge divide between the metropole and the countryside or the province. In Budapest, the typical voter is against Orbán. But in almost all of the other election districts, you'll see more than half of the people at least supporting most of Viktor Orbán's politics. So I would kind of couldn't maybe complicate it more than what you already said about the typical Trump voter. I think it connects to kind of the same understanding, which is also why you see Republicans from the States coming over, trying to get inspiration for their party in Hungary. You asked about the prognosis for the election in 9-10 days. All opinion polls show that nothing has changed significantly after the war, which means that Orbán is in favor to win. He might not get the 2/3 majority that his party has had for the past 3 terms. But I think a lot should happen in the next week if Orbán doesn't get re-elected. Okay.
Okay, we have 2 questions more, 2 more questions, please.
Okay.
Okay, hi, my name is Sophia Rivera. I'm an undergraduate studying history. I was an exchange student in Romania a few years ago, and I know that when I was living there, a lot of people didn't have much faith in the electoral system. Like voter turnout wasn't very large because of issues with corruption. A lot of people didn't have faith in the system as a whole. I'm wondering how that plays out in Hungary, especially in the smaller towns. Kind of corruption and then faith in the system.
Yeah. So voter turnout is relatively high in Hungary. At the last election, it was 70%. That was the highest in a few decades. it might be lower this time because, at least from my experience, the election campaign has been not as loud as it was 4 years ago. But there is a high turnout, and trust in the election system is divided as the country is. The Fidesz voters and also the government party is communicating that this is a democracy because people can go and give their vote. That's the essence of democracy. Whereas maybe in a liberal understanding of democracy, you would say there are more than just the vote. There's like importance of media, NGOs, independence of the courts and so on. So there's a very simple understanding on the right side of the spectrum. You go and give your vote, and then you, like one of the people I've interviewed says, then you contributed with one brick to your country. The election system was changed by the government in the new constitution when Orbán came to power. There's been a lot of gerrymandering. There's been basically, so I mentioned this party before, Jobbik, who used to be to the right of Fidesz, and then the left wing. So Orbán has, the election system is in favor of big parties. And since Fidesz is the only big party, he's been able to kind of keep this fragmentation of the other, of the opposition until now, where they've finally been able to, at least on the outward, they've been able to unite this election. You had another question about, what was that?
Maybe more specifically about corruption.
Corruption, yeah.
Yeah.
Corruption is very high in Hungary, as in Romania and other eastern states. It was also high before Orbán came, but it has been more organized after he came to power. So you can mention media, or I mentioned his childhood friend is Lorenz Mesaros, who used to be a gas fitter, simple man in a small village of Fellsjut, where they both used to grow up. He's now the richest man of Hungary. He owns some of the biggest construction companies in Hungary. They get a lot of EU contracts. There's a lot of EU support money from the European Union coming into his pockets and his company's pockets through these tenders. He says, and I quote that in the book, he says that the reason for his wealth is God, luck, and Viktor Orbán. So it's kind of in the open, everyone knows about it. And like you asked about before, the typical voter of Orbán, in my understanding, tends to kind of ignore that. I also mentioned these right-wing Americans coming to Hungary, and I always ask them, like, so, okay, you agree with Orbán on the anti-wokeness, you agree with the anti-migration, but can you accept this corruption of the society? And they also tend to kind of ignore that question. The reason for this kind of look the other way approach is I haven't gotten to a full understanding of that. In my own country, if there's corruption, the media will write about it. People with power would lose their power. So those are big problems of Hungary, the corruption.
I think we had another question. Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Esther Kardosh. I'm a Hungarian citizen myself. I'm also an undergrad at college. And I am curious, every time I go back home, there seems to be an air of hopelessness, a lot of despotism, especially among the young circles that I run into. And what that has come along with is a huge brain drain, where like every talented Hungarian I can think of is moving to London, moving to Copenhagen, moving quite frankly anywhere else. So I have two questions. One is, do you believe that this brain drain 10, 15 years from now is going to come back and bite Hungary, and like what the ramifications of that might look like? And more specifically, I'm curious, you said that your wife came to Debrecen to be a doctor, which is so confusing to me because every doctor I know wants to leave Hungary. So I'd love to hear about why she decided to do that.
Of course. So the first one, the brain drain, has been big in Hungary. If you take a country like Poland, it's been a lot of immigration from from Poland. It's been a lot of workers, you know, carpenters and so on. But Hungary, it's been the well-educated people who have left for London or Copenhagen or Berlin or Paris. Especially doctors. There's a huge lack of doctors in Hungary. What happened though was that the coronavirus crisis kind of brought a lot of people back. I'm not sure it changed their minds, but very important to understand that Hungary 10 years ago is very different from what it is now. If you have a relatively good education, you can get a relatively good job. The pay would not be as good as in Western Europe. But I talked to a few people here who actually came back because the grass was not always green on the other side. There's more to your life than a salary. But you're right, especially from Budapest, but also some of the other bigger cities, young people see their future not in, well, they want to be in Hungary, but they don't want to be in this Hungary. So a lot of them tend to leave. I think in 10, 15 years, the country will see some problems if it doesn't change. Orbán has his policy of wanting Hungarian women to have more kids. They don't want immigrants, but they want Hungarian kids. So I think it's the highest percentage of any European budget. The Hungarian one goes to families. So if you're a woman, you have 4 kids, you don't pay personal income tax. And it has changed the fertility rate quite a bit, despite, you know, there's different research and studies showing like how much it really is changing. So the thing is, people who leave, they also know that if they move away, their country will not change. So you can take that decision and move away and kind of forget about Hungary and hope that someone else would change it, or you could stay, or you could come back, like the leader of Momentum, which is a young opposition party, interviewing in the book the founder of this party, who took his education in, I think, Paris or in Berlin, and decided to come back because he doesn't want to just leave. He wants to come back and try to change it again. So there's a big inspiration in that term. So some people are coming back and wanting to change Hungary. The other question. So my wife, Nadia, maybe she's watching now also, she's an Icelandic citizen. And we lived in Copenhagen in 2012, 13. And she wanted to become a doctor. It's very difficult to get into medical school in Copenhagen and also back in Iceland. But in Debrecen, there's a big group of Icelandic medical students.
Interesting.
And that's actually, I can only say that's why we ended up in Debrecen. So you want to become a doctor there. It's a very acknowledged medical school at the University of Debrecen. People from all over the world come to this university and other universities in Hungary to become doctors. They don't stay in Hungary. My wife and I'm actually moving to Iceland. My wife is working as a doctor there now. And that's kind of the problem, that you educate a lot of doctors from abroad, but they stay there for 6-7 years and then they leave. But in that time, they give a lot to society. So there's studies showing that I think one student, foreign student, creates 1.3 jobs in Hungary. So there's a big connection there.
Is also the reason that people leave the language or a part of it? Because it's hard to learn.
The language is impossible. It's a part of it, of course. People who come from the Middle East to study, some of them stay in Hungary because Hungary is, compared to some of those countries, a better place to be. So it's a nuanced story of who comes and who stays.
We have another question from a YouTube viewer. He or she asked, can countries like Hungary and Poland remain in the EU given they have increasingly more authoritarian government?
Well, so far so good. The Article 7 of the European Union Treaty means that you could suspend the voting rights of certain countries. And this process has been going on for several years now without any conclusion, really. The newest development is that the EU is now able to punish economically these countries who are not fulfilling the European values. As we speak, the European Union is holding back a huge amount of support from the Corona crisis development fund and also from the budget. So the latest I heard was that Orbán wanted to kind of say that now that Hungary is taking so many refugees in, they would love to have access to this money now. So that's where it stands. It's been a lot of different attempts to punish Hungary and Poland, but so far the most successful one has been in the opinion of these countries, not in practice. They are not about to leave. You can't really kick them out as it is, and also they want to stay. I'm writing in the book about the German relationship to Hungary, which is say it goes both ways. So Hungary, there's a lot of German car factories and other production factories. So Germany is very dependent on Hungary to be in the European Union. This has kind of changed a little bit. Criticism has grown after Merkel left office, but there's definitely it's more complicated than just kicking two countries out of the European Union.
Right. And maybe if you can go back to this last section of your book, which is about interviews that you conducted with different Hungarians. And I assume that they are, as your title suggests, very polarized in their opinions. Having in mind how it does not work here in the US to put these together, these people with different opinions in a dialogue, is that something that it is possible to do in Hungary? Did you, were you involved in some of these attempts?
Well, so in hindsight, I should have not interviewed them one on one. I should have brought them all together, right? And put them at each side of the table.
Is that possible at all?
There are, I'm mentioning also, actually in that relation, I'm mentioning a few different projects who are trying to bring together people with different mindsets. But it's very hard to do in practice. Like, when's the last time you sat and talked and listened to a person that you really disagree with? Most of us, well, most of you, because I do it all the time, but a lot of people don't ever do that, and I think we should do that more, because it's so easy to just say like, oh, they're idiots, and there's no way I'll ever speak to them. It's just a waste of time. But it takes time, and I think that's basically that's key to kind of stop this polarization, is to be more curious about the ones we disagree with, and to listen more to those people. So that's what I try to do individually on these interviews. But I think for my next book, I'll bring people together.
Yeah, that would be a methodological step forward,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What is your next book? Do you have in mind another project? Or?
I actually am working on a book which is called Two Sides. It's the working title. It basically is like, you remember these old children books where you read one book from this side and then you turn around and you read it from that side. I've been kind of busy, so that book is on hold, but that would be about exact things that this book is also touching upon, but more in general, not on Hungary, but in general. How do we close this gap between different views? Important part is, like, we should not all agree. That's not the point, but we should be able to negotiate, debate, so on. I think that's important.
Well, thank you so much for this. I think there is a lot of interesting angles and viewpoints that you are employing in the book, and I hope it's going to be a really interesting read for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all
Thank you for
coming.
coming.